Elijah Reed pulled the baseball cap lower over his eyes as he stepped into the bustling cafe, the scent of fresh coffee and vanilla filling the air. He wasn't used to blending and his life had never required it. As one of the wealthiest men in the country, privacy was a luxury he rarely afforded himself. But after years of shallow relationships, where women saw only his billions and not the man behind them, he was done. For now, he was just Elijah, an ordinary man looking for something real. And then he saw her. She was behind the counter, her auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, a streak of flour dusting her cheek. There was something effortless about her, something genuine. Unlike the women he was used to, draped in designer clothes and calculating every move, she seemed completely unaware of the world noticing her. "Excuse me," he said, stepping forward. She glanced up, her amber eyes meeting his, and for a moment something in his chest tightened. "Hey there," she said, offering a warm smile. "What can I get you?" Elijah hesitated. He had been to the most exclusive restaurants, dined with royalty, but standing here in front of this woman, he felt uncharacteristically nervous. Coffee, black." "Simple man, I like it," she teased, turning to grab a cup. "Haven't seen you around before, new in town." "Something like that," he said vaguely. He wasn't about to tell her he owned half the skyscrapers in the city. "And you?" "I basically live here," she said, handing him the coffee. "This place is my second home. I'm Amelia, by the way." "Elijah," he took the cup, their fingers brushing for the briefest second. A strange warmth spread through him. "Well, Elijah, I hope you like the coffee. If not, no refunds," she said with a playful grin. He chuckled, bringing the cup to his lips. It was, without question, the best coffee he had ever had. But it wasn't just the taste, it was the way she looked at him, like he was just another customer, not someone with a fortune attached to his name. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Elijah found himself coming back to the cafe every morning. It wasn't just the coffee, though, that was excellent, it was her. Amelia was different. She didn't flirt for attention or bat her lashes, hoping for something in return. She was kind, sharp-witted, and had a laugh that made something in his chest loosen. "You again," she said one morning, handing him his usual before he even ordered. "You sound surprised," he said, taking the cup. "Not surprised, just wondering if I should start charging you rent." He chuckled, "Maybe I just like the atmosphere." She raised an eyebrow, "Or maybe you just like me." His grip on the cup tightened. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, but with her it kept happening. Maybe. For a second, silence stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Then a customer cleared their throat behind him and the moment passed. A week later, Elijah arrived at the cafe only to find Amelia struggling to carry a massive bag of flour inside. Without thinking, he rushed forward. "Here, let me help." She exhaled sharply, wiping her forehead. "Elijah, you don't have to." He took the bag effortlessly from her arms, carrying it inside. "I insist." She looked up at him, eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" He shrugged. "I like to be useful." She laughed, shaking her head. "Well, in that case, how do you feel about washing dishes?" He held up his hands. "Let's not get carried away." Amelia grinned, "Figured as much." But even as she teased him, there was something new in the way she looked at him, something softer. And for the first time in years, Elijah wondered if he had finally found what he'd been searching for. Someone who saw him, not his billions, not his power, just him. And for the first time, that was enough. Elijah had spent years navigating cutthroat boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals, but nothing had prepared him for the pull he felt toward Amelia. It was unfamiliar, this quiet longing. He didn't just want to be around her, he needed to. Every morning, he found himself at the cafe before he even realized he had made the decision to go. And every morning, she greeted him with that effortless warmth, completely unaware of who he really was. One evening, as he walked past the cafe after hours, he noticed the lights were still on. Through the window, he saw Amelia standing behind the counter, her forehead creased in frustration as she stared at a stack of papers. She rubbed her temples, exhaling slowly. Without thinking, he stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, making her jump. "Elijah," her eyes widened, "what are you doing here?" He hesitated, suddenly unsure if he had overstepped. I was just passing by, you looked tense. She let out a short laugh, gesturing to the papers. Yeah, you could say that. I'm trying to sort out the cafe's finances, but numbers and I have a complicated relationship. He moved closer, glancing at the figures. The numbers were a mess, expenses bleeding into revenue, invoices scattered without clear organization. It didn't take a financial expert to see that she was struggling. You need help, he said, his voice gentle. She sighed, I need a miracle. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Let me take a look. She gave him a skeptical glance. You know about this stuff. He held back a smile, if only she knew. I've picked up a few things over the years. She hesitated for a beat before sliding the papers toward him. Be my guest. As he sifted through the documents, he quickly spotted the problem. The cafe wasn't just struggling, it was barely staying afloat. Rent, supplier costs, unexpected repairs. It was a miracle she had kept it running this long. You're undercharging for some of your best items, he said, and your supplier is overcharging you. She groaned, I knew it, just didn't have the time or energy to argue. You don't have to argue, you negotiate. She raised an eyebrow, and you're good at that too. Let's just say I've had practice. She studied him for a long moment. You're full of surprises, Elijah. He kept his expression neutral. He had to tread carefully. If she knew who he really was, would she still look at him the same way? Let me help, he said, keeping his voice light. We can go over the numbers together. I promise, no arguing involved. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. All right, but if I suddenly start making a profit, I might have to put your name on the wall. He chuckled, I'll hold you to that. They spent the next 2 hours organizing her finances. She was sharp, catching on quickly, and despite the situation, they found themselves laughing between numbers. By the time they finished, she leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms. I can't believe we actually made sense of this mess. You did most of the work, he said. She shook her head. No, Elijah, don't think I could have done it without you. Something unspoken passed between them, something that made the air feel heavier, charged. She looked at him differently now, not just with gratitude, but with something deeper. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The following week, Amelia seemed lighter, more confident. She had adjusted her pricing, renegotiated with suppliers, and even introduced a new loyalty program. The cafe was thriving. One evening, she invited him to stay after closing. I owe you dinner, she said, and before you say anything, I don't take no for an answer. He didn't argue, he didn't want to. She cooked in the small kitchen at the back of the cafe, her movements effortless, like she had done this 1,000 times before. Cooking is my therapy, she admitted. Whenever life gets messy, I come here and fix something I can control. He watched her, taking in the way she moved, the way her eyes softened when she talked about the cafe. It's more than just a business to you, isn't it? She paused, then nodded. It was my mom's dream. She started this place when I was a kid. After she passed, I couldn't let it go. Something tightened in his chest. He knew loss. He knew the weight of carrying someone else's dream. You're doing her proud, he said softly. She looked at him, then really looked at him. You have that look. What look? Like you know what it's like to lose someone. He exhaled. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by my grandfather. He built an empire and expected me to do the same. Her expression softened. That's a lot of pressure. It was, still is. She tilted her head. Is that why you're here, trying to escape it? He hesitated. She was too perceptive. He had never been able to be this open with anyone before, and yet with her it felt natural. Something like that, he admitted. She didn't press him for more. She just nodded, accepting his answer. After dinner, they sat outside the cafe, the city quiet around them. She hugged her knees to her chest, looking up at the sky. You ever feel like you're waiting for something, but you don't know what? He turned his gaze toward her. Yeah, all the time. She smiled, but it was different this time, softer, more knowing. And for the first time in his life, Elijah wondered if he had finally found what he had been waiting for. Elijah had spent years mastering control, ensuring that no one saw past the polished exterior he had so carefully built. But with Amelia, it was different. He wasn't the billionaire mogul in tailored suits, making cutthroat business decisions. He was just a man sitting across from a woman who made him feel something real for the first time in years. But the illusion couldn't last forever. One evening, he arrived at the cafe to find Amelia pacing near the register, a crease of frustration between her brows. She had an official-looking letter clutched in one hand, her fingers curled tightly around the paper. When she saw him, she exhaled sharply, as if his presence alone was enough to steady her. "I got a notice today," she said, holding out the letter. "The building's landlord is selling the property, and if I can't match the buyer's offer, I have 30 days to vacate." Elijah took the letter and scanned the details. The offer was steep, more than she could ever afford. His jaw tightened. He knew how these things worked. A larger corporation was circling, ready to swoop in and turn her beloved cafe into another soulless chain. She raked a hand through her hair, frustration evident in every line of her body. "I knew things were tough, but I didn't think I was running out of time." He wanted to fix this. It would be so simple to step in, to buy the building outright and ensure she never had to worry about it again. But how could he explain that without revealing everything, without shattering the fragile trust between them? Instead, he took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "There has to be a way to fight this. Negotiation, maybe." She let out a humorless laugh. "With what money, I barely managed to keep things running as it was." His chest tightened. He wasn't used to feeling helpless, but for once he couldn't just throw money at a problem without consequence. He needed a way to help that wouldn't expose him. After a long silence, Amelia met his gaze, something searching in her expression. "You know a lot about business, more than most people I know. How?" The question was direct, and for the first time since meeting her, he felt the weight of his deception pressing down on him. "I've been around it my whole life," he admitted. "I understand how these things work." She studied him, her amber eyes sharp with curiosity. "You're not just some guy who likes coffee, are you?" His pulse quickened. If he wasn't careful, this was where everything unraveled. Before he could find an answer, the cafe door swung open and a sharply dressed man strode in, his gaze locking onto Amelia. "Miss Carter," the man said smoothly, ignoring Elijah entirely. "I wanted to speak with you about your options regarding the sale." Elijah recognized him immediately. Charles Whitmore, a real estate developer known for acquiring small businesses and flipping them into high-end properties. Amelia squared her shoulders. "There's nothing to discuss, I'm not selling." Charles gave a patronizing smile. "Understand your attachment, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. I represent an interested buyer who's willing to make this transition as smooth as possible for you." Elijah's hands curled into fists. He had seen men like this before, using thinly veiled concern to disguise their greed. Amelia lifted her chin. "I won't let this place be turned into another overpriced cafe for people who don't care about the community." Charles sighed as if he were dealing with a child. "If you change your mind, my offer stands, but I'd act fast, these things move quickly." He slid a business card onto the counter before turning on his heel and leaving. The moment he was gone, Amelia let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Elijah stepped closer. "You don't have to do this alone." She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "I don't have a choice." But he did. And for the first time in his life, Elijah realized that money meant nothing if he couldn't use it to protect the one person who had ever truly mattered. Elijah spent the next 24 hours making phone calls, pulling strings behind the scenes. He acquired the building under a separate entity, ensuring his name never appeared anywhere on the paperwork. Amelia would never have to know. The next morning, he arrived at the cafe to find her sitting at a corner table, staring at the financial books with a defeated expression. He slid into the seat across from her. "I have an idea." She lifted her gaze, exhaustion etched into her features. "Unless it involves magically coming up with a six-figure sum, I'm all out of ideas." He leaned in slightly. A fundraiser, a community event, get people invested in saving the cafe. Her brows knitted together. You think that could work? If this place means as much to the community as it does to you, then yes. Something flickered in her eyes. Hope maybe. I don't know where to start. You won't be doing it alone. She exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You really don't give up, do you? He met her gaze, unwavering, not when it matters. And Amelia, she mattered more than anything. The event came together faster than either of them expected. Local businesses donated supplies, musicians volunteered to perform, and word spread quickly. The night of the fundraiser, the cafe was packed with people, all gathered in support of Amelia. Elijah watched from the sidelines as she moved through the crowd, thanking everyone personally. There was a light in her eyes tonight, the same spark that had drawn him to her from the start. At one point, she found him near the back of the room. This is incredible, she said, voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. His chest tightened. You don't have to. She studied him for a long moment before stepping closer. I don't know what I'd do without you, Elijah. He swallowed hard. He had never wanted anything more than he wanted this moment to be real. But the lie between them loomed larger than ever. And then, before he could stop himself, he reached for her. Their lips met in a kiss that felt inevitable, like something that had been waiting to happen from the very first moment they met. Amelia pulled back slightly, her forehead resting against his. I don't know what this is, she whispered, but I don't want it to end. Neither did he. But deep down, Elijah knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. And when it came out, he could only pray it wouldn't destroy everything. The night of the fundraiser had changed everything. Elijah had spent years building walls around himself, but with Amelia they had crumbled effortlessly. The kiss had been inevitable, a culmination of the quiet moments, the laughter, the way she looked at him as if he were just a man and not the billionaire the world saw. But the truth loomed over him like a storm cloud. The next morning he woke with a sense of urgency pressing against his ribs. He had to tell her. He couldn't keep this secret any longer. Every moment he spent by her side was built on something fragile, and if she found out from someone else, it would shatter everything. By the time he reached the cafe, Amelia was already inside, wiping down tables, the warm scent of fresh pastries in the air. When she looked up and saw him, a slow, easy smile spread across her face. Something in him clenched. He didn't want to lose that. She motioned for him to sit as she brought him a cup of coffee, sliding into the chair across from him. There was a lightness in her expression, a quiet happiness that made his heart ache. I still can't believe last night, she said. I don't know how to wrap my head around it. People actually care about this place. They care enough to fight for it. His hands curled around the cup, the warmth grounding him. They care because of you. She tilted her head slightly as if trying to read him. And you, I don't think I could have done this without you. The sincerity in her voice made his chest tighten. This was exactly why he had come into her life as Elijah, not as Elijah Reed, billionaire. He had wanted something real, and now that he had it, he was about to risk everything. He exhaled slowly. Amelia, there's something I need to tell you. Before he could continue, the cafe door swung open, and a man strode inside, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Elijah stiffened. He recognized him instantly. Philip Ashford, a business columnist notorious for exposing high-profile figures. Philip's gaze landed on Amelia first, then shifted to Elijah, narrowing slightly. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something sharper, more calculating. Elijah Reed, Philip said smoothly, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. Have to say, I never expected to find you here. The words slammed into the space between them like a wrecking ball. Amelia's brows furrowed as she glanced between them. Elijah Reed. She said it slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. Philip's smile was razor-sharp. You didn't tell her, did you? Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't how he had wanted her to find out. Amelia pushed back from the table, standing abruptly, her gaze locked onto Elijah, now filled with something unreadable. What is he talking about? He stood too, but the space between them suddenly felt insurmountable. Amelia, I was going to tell you. Philip let out a low chuckle. Oh, this is rich. The billionaire hiding in plain sight pretending to be an ordinary guy. I bet that was fun for you. Elijah ignored him, his entire focus on Amelia. I never meant to deceive you. Her hands clenched at her sides, but you did. The betrayal in her voice cut deeper than he had ever expected. Philip stepped back with a satisfied air. I'll leave you two to talk, though something tells me there won't be much left to say. As the door shut behind him, silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Amelia shook her head, her expression raw. All this time, you let me believe. I didn't want you to see the money first, he interrupted, desperate to make her understand. I wanted you to see me. She let out a sharp breath, her hands trembling slightly. And what about this cafe, the fundraiser? Were you just playing along knowing you could have fixed everything with a single check? No, he said firmly, that was real, every moment with you was real. She exhaled slowly as if trying to process everything at once. You should have told me, Elijah, you should have trusted me. The truth of her words hit him harder than he expected. He had trusted her more than anyone. But he had also been afraid that the moment he revealed his identity, everything between them would change. And now it had. She took a step back, shaking her head. I need time. His stomach twisted, but he didn't push. He had no right to. With one final glance, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the middle of the cafe, his hands empty, his heart heavier than it had ever been. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Elijah stayed away, giving Amelia the space she had asked for, but every second apart felt unbearable. He had built billion-dollar empires, but he had never felt as hollow as he did now. Then one evening, he received a message. It was from Amelia. A simple request, meet me at the cafe. When he arrived, the place was empty, the lights dimmed except for the glow from the back. She stood behind the counter, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Finally, she spoke, I don't need your money. He swallowed hard, I know. She exhaled, her shoulders softening slightly. Spent the last few days trying to figure out if what I felt for you was real, or if I was just caught up in something I didn't understand. His pulse pounded and a slow, hesitant smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It's real. Relief hit him like a tidal wave. But she continued, lifting a brow, if we do this, there can't be any more secrets. No more hiding. He stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. No more secrets. She studied him for a beat longer before finally, closing the distance between them. And when she leaned in, pressing her lips against his, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise. A promise that billionaire or not, he was hers. And she was his. Elijah had never been a man to hesitate. In business, in life, he made decisions with precision, never doubting his path. But standing in Amelia's cafe now, with the warmth of her touch still lingering on his skin, he knew this was different. There had been no contracts, no negotiations, no calculated risks, just her. And for the first time, he was willing to risk everything for something he couldn't control. The days that followed carried a new rhythm, one built on honesty. He had told her everything about the empire he had inherited, the weight of expectations, the loneliness that had driven him to seek something real in a world that only saw dollar signs. She listened, never interrupting, never pulling away. Instead, she let him speak, absorbing every truth he had withheld. And when he was done, she hadn't recoiled. She hadn't looked at him differently. She had simply reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Now, as they closed up the cafe together one evening, there was a quiet ease between them, a certainty that hadn't been there before. She locked the door and turned to face him. So what happens now? The question wasn't spoken with doubt, only curiosity. He exhaled, considering his words. I don't know, he admitted. For once, I don't have a plan. A smile flickered across her lips. That's a first. He chuckled, shaking his head. I've spent my entire life knowing exactly what's next, but with you, I don't want to decide everything ahead of time. I want to figure it out as we go. She tilted her head slightly as if considering his answer. That sounds terrifying. It is, he said, stepping closer, but it's also the only thing that feels right. She didn't pull away. Instead, she reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. You're really not what I expected. Disappointed. Her gaze softened, not even close. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the city humming quietly around them. Then, as if making a decision, she took his hand and squeezed it gently. Come on. He arched a brow. Where are we going? She grinned. I think it's time you saw something outside of your world. They walked through the city, past the towering buildings that bore his influence, past the restaurants where he had once closed deals worth millions. But tonight, none of that mattered. Instead, she led him down quieter streets, where the lights weren't as bright and the air smelled of fresh bread and spices from small, family-owned restaurants. She pulled him toward a tiny diner, the kind of place he had never thought to step into before. The neon sign flickered overhead, paint peeling from the edges of the doorframe. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sizzling food, the hum of conversation. It was nothing like the high-end establishments he was used to. But as Amelia slid into a booth and motioned for him to do the same, he realized he didn't care. She ordered without hesitation, speaking to the older woman behind the counter like they had known each other forever. When the food arrived, it was simple, nothing plated like an art piece, no imported ingredients flown in from across the world, just warmth and familiarity. She watched him as he took his first bite, amusement dancing in her eyes. Well. He swallowed, then nodded. Better than any five-star meal I've had. She laughed, shaking her head. I knew it. They ate, talking about things that had nothing to do with money or business. She told him about the places she wanted to visit, the things she had never had the time or resources to do. And for the first time in his life, Elijah found himself dreaming of a future not built on mergers and acquisitions, but on moments like this. When they left the diner, the night air was cool, a gentle breeze sweeping through the streets. She glanced up at him. Do you regret it? He frowned slightly. Regret what? Not telling me the truth sooner. He exhaled, considering the weight of the question. Part of me does, he admitted, but another part. Think I needed to see if this was real before I risked losing it. She nodded slowly as if understanding, and now. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, steady. Now I don't want to waste another second. A slow smile spread across her lips. Good. They walked in silence, the city stretching out before them, vast and full of possibility. And for the first time in his life, Elijah Reed wasn't chasing success. He was chasing something far more valuable. Something he had finally found. The world shifted subtly after that night. Something unspoken settled between them, solid, certain. Amelia no longer looked at Elijah with guarded curiosity, and he no longer hesitated in reaching for her. The weight of his name, his wealth, his past, it all faded in the presence of what they had built together. But life had a way of testing even the strongest foundations. A week passed in a blur of quiet moments and stolen kisses behind the cafe counter. Elijah remained by her side, helping where he could, never overstepping, always letting her lead. He marveled at the way she moved in her space, her hands dusted with flour, her laughter ringing through the cozy cafe as she chatted with customers. One afternoon, as they were locking up, Amelia leaned against the counter, a contemplative look on her face. Something about her expression made Elijah pause. She traced the rim of a coffee cup absent-mindedly before looking up at him. I got a call this morning. His brow lifted slightly. Good news. She hesitated, then nodded. It was from the landlord. He said the building's purchase went through and the new owner isn't looking to sell. The words settled between them. Elijah already knew, of course he did. He had orchestrated it all behind the scenes, ensuring that no one could take this place away from her. But he had never expected her to hear about it so soon. Her eyes searched his face, something knowing in their depths. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Elijah held her gaze, debating for just a second, but there was no point in hiding anymore. He had promised her honesty. I bought it, he admitted. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't look surprised. Elijah. I didn't do it because I think you need my money, he said before she could continue. I did it because I knew what this place means to you, and I couldn't stand by and watch someone take it away. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. You should have told me. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything, he said, his voice steady. I wanted you to have this free and clear. Silence stretched between them, thick with emotion. Then slowly she shook her head, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. You really don't do things halfway, do you? A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not when it comes to you. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing over his. I don't need grand gestures, Elijah. I know, he said, but I needed to do this anyway. Her expression softened, something deep and unshakable settling in her gaze. Thank you. And with those two words, he knew she understood. Nothing more needed to be said. That night, they walked through the city again, their steps unhurried. The streets were quieter now, the lights casting long shadows against the pavement. Amelia slipped her hand into his, her fingers lacing through his as if they had always belonged there. Elijah inhaled deeply, allowing himself to savor the simplicity of the moment. Then, as they reached a small park tucked between two buildings, he stopped, turning to face her fully. She looked up at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What is it? His heartbeat was steady, sure. He had built empires, made decisions that shaped industries, but this decision, this moment, was the only one that had ever truly mattered. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Amelia's breath hitched. Elijah. I never expected to find this, he said, his voice low, steady. I never thought I'd meet someone who made me want to step away from everything I've built just to stand still for a moment and truly live. Her eyes shimmered, and he saw the exact moment she realized what was happening. I love you, Amelia, he continued. Not because you see me as something more than my wealth, but because you see me, period. You make me want to be better. You make me want more than I ever thought possible. He dropped to one knee, the box opening to reveal a ring, a simple, elegant design, nothing ostentatious, just something that felt right. I don't want a life where you're just a part of it, he said. I want a life that we build together. Marry me. Tears slipped down Amelia's cheeks, but her smile was radiant, unwavering. You're really bad at surprises, you know that. He chuckled, I'll work on it. She exhaled shakily, then nodded, yes. Relief crashed over him, and before he could stand, she threw herself into his arms, knocking him slightly off balance. He laughed, catching her easily as she buried her face into his shoulder. Oh, yes, she whispered again. He pulled back just enough to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like everything between them. As he kissed her, the city hummed around them, but all Elijah could feel was her steady, warm his. Forever. The wedding was intimate, nothing like the grand, opulent affairs expected of a man like him. Amelia had insisted on something small, something that felt like them. So, beneath a canopy of twinkling lights, surrounded by only their closest friends, they exchanged vows. Elijah, dressed in a sleek black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. Amelia stood before him in a dress that wasn't extravagant, yet she looked more breathtaking than any woman he had ever seen. When she spoke her vows, her voice was steady, filled with certainty. You walked into my life when I least expected it. You showed up every morning, stubborn and persistent, and somewhere along the way, you became the one person I couldn't imagine my life without. His throat tightened. She smiled. I didn't fall in love with the billionaire. I fell in love with the man who carried bags of flour without being asked, who stayed up late helping me fix my books, who saw me when no one else did. Elijah didn't care about the audience watching them. He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly. "I never knew what I was looking for until I found you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And now that I have, I will never let go." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply as their guests erupted into cheers. And as he held her close, he knew without a doubt that this was the greatest deal he had ever made. "A lifetime with her,"